everybody. My name is Carl Rogerson. I'm the Director of Bilsey Research School. And tonight's session is one of our optional modules as part of our programme with Sandal Secondary Schools on our Making a Difference for Disadvantaged programme. I'm very pleased that Nathan, I know you as the Director of John Taylor Research School, but you have a number of roles as well, so I'll let you introduce your full title in a second. But Nathan's going to talk to us this evening about metacognition and self-regulation and how it can support pupil progress across the school and across a range of subjects. So I'll hand you over to Nathan now. Thanks very much, Nathan.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl. Afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm Nathan Morland. I'm the Director of the Staffordshire Research School. I'm also Director of a teaching school at John Taylor as well. And then from September, going to be the new teaching school hub at John Taylor. So juggling quite a few balls at the minute. But tonight about Sandwell and about metacognition. A really important session this is actually. I think generally in the not only in the disadvantaged approach, but also just generally in our school planning, school life, teaching and learning, and the value that it can bring. I'm going to try and be quite ambitious and cover quite a lot. Just to bear in mind that we do at the Research School Network a 3-day or a 9-module training program on metacognition, and we also have a guidance report which is quite lengthy, and I think what I'm trying to say here is that in a couple of hours, an hour and 50 minutes, I'll try and squeeze in as much as possible. I'll try and make it a bit interactive. I want you to reflect quite a lot on your current practices and your current provision, but what I will do is I will try and pack it full of information, so that at times there will be me relaying a fair few bits of information to you, but broken up by tasks in between. And I'm just going to try and present my screen now and see if I can pull up my slides. Which it hasn't allowed me to do, so there we go. So okay, are you able to see my slides? Is that okay?
Got them. Yes.
Yeah. Right. So, like I said before, I'm going to be trying to be quite ambitious. The whole overview of this, obviously, being metacognition and self-regulated learning. And first of all, we're going to explore what a common language and what that looks like in your own schools. I'm going to really try and get under the bonnet of the evidence and look at the evidence, not just in the guidance report, but a recent review that had taken place as well. Dispel some of those myths, look at student learning behaviours and how that might present, how it might manifest itself in behaviours in your classroom and learning behaviours, and associate with the children and students that you teach. And then I'm going to also try and hopefully look at providing you with some takeaways, some resources, some strategies, again, some evaluation methods in your own schools, and then look at planning structures and planning resources. And then some, again, at the end of that as well, some further resources to take away to see if this is something which you will, I guess, embed into your school improvement planning for the next academic year as a key part of this course. What I do want to start off with is just, that where we always start, really defining it, isn't it? All I want you to do is take a minute to blank piece of paper in front of you, is to really just go through your thoughts and think, right, okay, metacognition, it's a term which is used a lot in education, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. It's a term which has really gathered quite a lot of momentum. But what does it actually mean for yourself? How would you define it in a sentence or a statement? And then whilst you're doing that, I want you to think to yourself, is this the common language that would be used across my staff? So I'm just going to give you 60 seconds of thought there. One statement: what is metacognition in your schools, and how is it discussed in your schools? Because it can be quite a frightening term for some members of staff, and by that I mean a technical term which people struggle to define. So I'm just going to pause there. I'm just going to change my view so that I can Okay, I don't know if anybody wants to just to volunteer and just to start us off. Brave thing, obviously, to do jump first when we've got people and colleagues that we might not be used to sharing with, but it's not going to go beyond this this group of us. So, where would we start in defining what we mean by metacognition, particularly in your schools? Be interesting to hear. Any volunteers? Right. Let me come out of this because it's difficult. I can't see people at the same time when I'm sharing. Is that usual? Joanna, are you there? Oh, some people have put it in the chat. Brilliant, Bally, thanks. Metacognition means a process of thinking. Cognition comes from psychology, meaning thoughts and thinking processes. Meta means building big, so structures thinking into micro and macro using Bloom's taxonomy. Excellent. Okay, lovely. Previously learnt materials in the awareness of understanding and using this going forward in the learning process. Okay, great. Okay, some people can't unmute. Okay, learning to learn, somebody's put there. No, okay. Okay, great. And there's Joanna as well, self-regulation. All right, lovely. Right, well, I'll jump back into my slides then. And I will, oh, someone's got a fire alarm going off. Great timing. Right. So I will, I'll jump back into my sharing my slides. Again, it's, there we go. So in the actual guidance report, it refers to metacognition being about the ways in which learners monitor and purposefully direct their learning. Now, having run this course before, or this aspect of courses before, and there's a couple of definitions which have been produced before, which actually quite nicely capture an approach from teachers and what they say about it. So a range of mental strategies to regulate and hone the process of learning or problem solving, and then thinking about the best way to learn or approach a task. Choose the best approach, but then be able to reflect on its effectiveness. And actually, that one on the right-hand side is my favourite of the lot, because I think what it does is it takes a term of metacognition, which can be seen kind of daunting to define, and puts it really kind of nicely into simple ways to communicate with members of our staff. With the definitions that you wrote down on your paper or in the chat that you put in there, just reflect on that there and think to yourself, right, okay, is there a common language which is used in your school? And if you were to gauge staff what the common language of metacognition would be, then what would that language involve? And is it a common language at all? I think that's the first point to ask, is it common? Because if it's not, then there's probably a bit of groundwork to be done on what do we mean by metacognition and self-regulation before we move forward. The guidance report does mention terms like thinking about thinking or learning to learn, or even learning about learning, but those definitions, they're not kind of well-rounded. They don't really provide you with the details behind it of what we actually do. And one of our colleagues at Kingsbridge Research School actually said, well, it's a bit like saying to somebody, well, I want to learn to play the guitar. And they say, well, if you want to learn to play the guitar, practice playing the guitar. And they said, well, what should I practice? And they said, well, practice learning how to play. And it doesn't really, it's not really a closed loop definition. It doesn't really give us any more than what it suggests on this very, very surface level. So, you know, when we think about how would we say it to students, we'll probably say, well, understanding how I learn best and make the decisions about how to learn best. And then if we think about breaking down the actual term of metacognition and self-regulation and how it all fits together, in that guidance report, it says it's impossible to be metacognitive without having different cognitive strategies to hand, and that's absolutely right. You know, the meta comes after the cognition. So 3 areas is that the cognition, which the toolkit kind of defines, sorry, the guidance report defines as the toolkit, your cognitive toolkit, the strategies that you have to complete the task successfully. And then once we've kind of got that filing cabinet of all those tools of what we could use when we're learning, after deciding on which ones to employ and which ones to use, that's where the metacognition comes in, where we're evaluating how successful that cognitive toolkit is, the selection of our tools. And they actually define it as the internal barometer of success. So we're thinking about all the time, how can we develop the depth of our children, our pupils' cognitive toolbox? How can we make sure we put more tools in that box? And then constantly, not only is it the use of those tools, but how can we get children to evaluate whether those tools are the right choice, whether they're successful, or whether they need to look at alternative options towards their learning. And obviously with that then comes motivation as well. There needs to be a willingness to engage with your toolbox and to engage with your evaluative aspects. And when we do engage with the evaluative aspects, that's when we become well-rounded, regulated learners, which is all very, very challenging because, you know, within there we've got motivation, we've got the tools, and we've got the kind of what many would call the independence of being an independent learner, being able to evaluate successfully what's going on. And at each stage, we can have the wrong selection, we can have inaccurate evaluation, or we could have a lack of willingness to engage. So we're tackling it on a number of fronts, really. The toolkit, the guidance report includes this quote here. And I'll just pause and let you read that because it kind of re-emphasizes each aspect. Now, the EEF have actually tried to conceptualize all of that into a fairly simple and nicely structured diagram, which makes it accessible. And that's part of the role of the EEF with these guidance reports, is the piece of research by Zimmerman, and there are many others as well in a review of evidence that I'm going to show you. They've come up with a number of different ways of presenting what metacognition is, and within there's some quite complex diagrams that obviously involve, you know, modelling, scaffolding, and the way in which the cognition of the brain works and how children are learn, all into some quite complex diagrams. Well, the aim of the EEF and the guidance reports is to synthesize that research and make it really digestible for teachers and for leaders to put into practice in their schools. The diagram which they have actually develops is split into 2 sections, and what they've said is actually, in order for us to think about this in schools, we need to consider metacognitive knowledge and then metacognitive regulation, and think about these from 2 aspects of planning. So when I put those 2 parts of the diagram together, it looks like this. And with this is a kind of a huge feedback loop around the outside, is we're considering each of these aspects through our planning, but also then through the delivery. And by this I mean through our planners and teachers' planning, through our delivery, and then evaluation. But this is also happening at a student level as well, where they will be constantly evaluating what their understanding of the task, their strategies, and their knowledge of their self are. And this kind of is something which we need to explore in a bit more detail, and something which, you know, we need to consider whether we need to explore this with our staff and their professional developments, so that they can really get to grips with how they implement this and how it manifests itself in their planning, their thoughts to planning on a daily and weekly basis. So the EEF have clearly said there about self-regulated learners being aware of their strengths and weaknesses and how it can motivate to engage in and improve their learning. Another aspect which, as a definition wise, came from metacognition.org.uk. I've got their hyperlink towards the end, and they've put, which is quite nicely framed, the evaluation of cognition before, during and after a task, and I like that as well. And you'll see below, and I don't know who Frank is, but below someone's put there, again, they've come back to thinking about thinking, and that seems to be a common language among staff, is they say it's learning about learning or thinking about thinking, without going beyond what that actually means into, you know, all of these six aspects that the EEF have put into place there. So, what we need to do first of all then is just explore that in a little bit way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a passage of text up onto the screen, and all I want you to do is I want you to see how far you can get with translating it, or whilst you are faced with this task, just think to yourself and really kind of really reflect on this and think to yourself, as I'm dealing with this task that is placed in front of me, what thought processes am I going through? Okay, so passage of text should appear on your screen now. How far can you get with it? And if you can't get too far with it, what thought processes are going through your mind as you try to deal with that task, or as you're faced with a task which is quite challenging? And if you're a Welsh speaker, then your thoughts will be very different now, I'm sure. Okay, now we might not need too long on that one. So, any thoughts? Yeah, someone's popped in the chat box there, thinking, oh dear, this is like a completely different language and I don't know Welsh. Absolutely correct, yeah. Any other thoughts? Did anyone get any far? Did anyone try to start to decipher what it meant and any strategies or not? Or did everybody just think, okay. Sorry, I don't know your first name, but F. Wilk. So let's just put, what does it remind me of? And trying to make a link and bridge it to previous experiences of learning potentially, or if there was any common kind of use of vowels or syntax, or did anyone manage to get anything? Do we think, did anyone manage to get very far at all? Potentially not, with it being Welsh, one of the most difficult languages. Okay, well, I'll jump back onto my screen then, and see if we can put this back up. There we go. So, when it is translated, that's what it kind of means, but you know, whether that's relevant or not at this point, I think what's more relevant is we explore the thought processes in relation to metacognition, and what I mean, you know, the options that we could have thought about could have been along the lines of what was in the chat box there. Oh my word, this is quite challenging. This is quite difficult. What are my options? Could I go to a translation? What's the easiest option? This task's too hard. I haven't got past the first sentence, so therefore I'm not going to bother because I can't do this. I might have given up. And those kind of thought process, if we just think about that, whilst it's not asking you to translate or asking children necessarily to translate kind of Welsh language into meaning for them. Those thought processes will be very similar when they're faced with challenging tasks, and it's those types of things that we're going to explore. So just running through that then, when we think about this diagram here about metacognitive knowledge and regulation, well, the first thing is we're looking at the top end of this diagram. Metacognitive knowledge of the task, knowledge of strategies, and knowledge of their self. And the first things they might, the question might be, well, what's all this, what's all this about? What's all this Welsh business about? And the thought processes linking to that then will be an exploration of their cognitive toolkit. Thinking about what have I got in my toolkit already? Sorry, let's just switch back on. What have I got in my toolkit already? Am I able to translate this? Where might I have translated before? What other language? Somebody put in the chat box there, have I come across this before? What type of skills? Do I know anything about the Welsh language? And if that's a no, then okay, well, what else can I explore? What do I know about vocab? What do I know about syntax or grammar? Can I decode it? Is there any pattern that I can see that emerges in there for short words that appear more regularly that might mean something? Obviously you're going to have to be fairly motivated to get beyond that. Oh my gosh, this is quite a difficult task. And then within there was subject knowledge as well. In this case, it was political knowledge. What do I know about politics? So there's a number of levels about engaging with this material. So we've got to think about all of that from a teacher's perspective in our planning. I led teaching and learning in 2 secondary schools, and these things are hard to do, and they're hard to get right, purely for the consistency of approach, but also the amount of time that we have with teachers to dedicate towards developing them, and everything seems to be a rush over the school year. And what we're trying to do is constantly develop through on many different fronts, aren't we? Whether it be disadvantage, whether it be metacognition, whether it be other school improvement priorities that are there for us, literacy or whatever it may be. So trying to get this into planning and really effective planning. Going back to this diagram as well here, children might be thinking, well, I've done translation before, but it was French, so is any of this similar? So they're searching through that toolkit to see if they can apply some of these strategies. But they're being metacognitive, which is excellent. How long have I got to do this translation? And I've added some further bits down the bottom here. Am I allowed any help? Is there a translator? Is there an online tool? What's the easiest way? What degree of success will be acceptable in relation to my peers? What do they know that I don't? And then they're faced with this challenge and this fear of failure versus the that kind of flight or fight mechanism. And then how are my peers performing? So all of that kind of is going around the cycle in the children's mind while they're attempting a task which is new to them. And it could be any new task. It could be a sum in maths. It could be deciphering or kind of understanding a Second World War poem, GCSE English. It could be any of those. What would they then need to do? Well, first thing they need to do is to think to themselves, well, what is the topic? What is it actually about? What in this case, we would think, well, what can I recognise? And it might well have been the names of the people that we might have been familiar. So we know that the story is about some people. The politics in this case was about some people. And then at this point, you might go, well, actually, I can't go beyond that. So I'm going to use an online translation tool, or I'm going to look for an alternative option. That's still being metacognitive, though, isn't it? Because it's figuring out what the strategy is to move themselves on. And then again, looking at when you do translate on Google for that Welsh language, it still doesn't come up accurate because the sentences don't make sense. And so you still have to then evaluate whether that method was successful, and some further checking is required. What does that really mean for some students? Well, like I said before, this is really confusing. I don't like Welsh, I can't be bothered. I'll wait until PE. Or, I need to be able to do this type of thing, otherwise I'll struggle in other aspects, and I need to give it a go and do as much as I possibly can. At which point, as teachers, we're there to begin to support, to scaffold, to motivate, and to think about how we can break down complex tasks to allow students to access it. And that's where obviously it links significantly with our planning. And all of this really is about understanding what that means and what that means from a pupil perspective. But one thing I am going to do is I'm going to ask you at this point to do a little bit of reflection on your school. So I'm just going to come out of sharing my screen here. And in the chat box, I'm going to put a hyperlink. And that hyperlink, if you can access that, will take you to a tool which the EEF have produced, which is an audit tool. And it's an audit tool for pupil knowledge and behaviours for metacognition. And with that, it has 3 sections. First one is about pupil knowledge and behaviours. The second section is about teacher knowledge. And the third section is around whole school approaches to curriculum and teaching. And they're all interwoven with metacognition and self-regulated learners. As you click on that hyperlink, and it'll take you to that toolkit. And what I'd like you to do is just have a look at the section which is entitled the teacher knowledge section. And from your school perspective, or depending on your role in school, if you're a middle leader, you might want to look at it from your department or your year group's perspective. Just have a look down the criteria and kind of almost go through a mental check-off of whereabouts in that criteria would I place the staff in our school. Are we at the ineffective level, the improving level, or the exemplary level? And I'm just going to pause for 2 or 3 minutes to allow you to engage with that resource. reshare again. My computer decided to have a little go slow. Okay, so the resource then that you hopefully have had a chance to interact with, and just looking at that teacher audit toolkit, really, really useful thing to do from a leader's perspective to understand where we think we're at in relation to the metacognitive knowledge of teachers, but also in the other areas as well. So I urge you to have a look at it from a pupil perspective and from an approach to curriculum and teaching. What's a really useful task, which we've done at school here, is to do that across the whole body of middle leaders, particularly to see if we get a consistent return. And I think before, when I was asking about a consistent language and is that a common language in your school, well, actually with this audit here, is it a common understanding or is it a common perception of where we think we're at in terms of metacognition and self-regulation, from our understanding, from our planning, from our curriculum, and then from how children respond to it as well. A really, really useful exercise to do as a benchmarking exercise, particularly before we're going to go on and do some professional development and some real clear exemplification of planning and what that looks like. So the next step is really to get under the bonnet of the research, and I've got about 7 or 8 slides where I'm just going to review the research and just go through what those key findings were. So if you bear with me for this one, there's loads and loads of research, and in many cases it's very complex. Like I said, the research is not necessarily in a digestible format for teachers to pick up at the end of a very busy day, and to go, right, okay, will this metacognition work? How am I going to put it into my planning? So why are we doing it? Well, you know, as you'll know through the disadvantage course that you've done with Billsley about the toolkits and the cost versus effect size, that actually what we're looking for in an ideal world is low cost, high impact strategies, of which metacognition comes second on that, the EEF toolkit behind feedback. And why are we doing it? Well, as the EEF have said there in the guidance report, it's the fabric of successful learning. The reason why it being the fabric is because with metacognition, already through that diagram, you'll have seen that it involves reflection and evaluation from pupils. It incorporates elements of motivation. It has to be into kind of weaved with the subject knowledge and that subject pedagogy, and being able to kind of not separate it as a subject. It has to be completely integrated. So in order to have metacognition, you actually need subject content and knowledge to be able to be metacognitive. It links specifically with memory and some aspects of planning, which we'll move on to later on, but also about self-awareness. And then through the research as well, it talks about retention of staff through motivation, which is quite an indirect positive of this. And then one thing which we're kind of really thinking as well is about the impact. And there's a few things which I'll get onto with the research in a second about the impact and what impact it can have for disadvantaged learners, disadvantaged students, but it can be a high impact approach to improving the attainment of our least effective learners and our most effective learners as well. And I think that has some implications when we're thinking about planning and approaches later on, which I'll mention. And where else should we really focus on metacognition? Well, it's a key part of many aspects of the rollout of. Just jump back. I don't know why. That must be my mouse. And a key aspect of many parts of the introduction to the profession and the teacher standards as well. So, you know, I talk about the core content framework for trainee teachers. There's just a couple of statements from the core content framework for initial teacher education. Particularly, the trainees will learn how to model effectively, narrating thought processes when modeling, and they have to learn that metacognitive strategies are linked to subject knowledge, including how to plan, monitor and evaluate. So right from the beginning of our profession, it's a real core aspect of the content framework. That is then built upon by the early careers framework, of which it's included in and will be rolled out from September. And you might have heard me and Carl talking about the reformed MPQs as well at the beginning of the presentation, just before we started, and that is a real key aspect as well. It's what the DFE call their golden thread, which runs right the way through all aspects of teacher standards. So an expectation that teachers in schools, whatever their experience and their length of time within the profession, are expected to know and be able to deliver effectively on it. When we get under the bonnet, how secure is the evidence? Well, you'll be, I'm sure, aware of the teacher toolkit at the bottom. The EEF toolkit has an evidence base that's incredibly strong, shown by those 4 padlocks. Has an effect size of +7 months within a 12-month period. If implemented effectively, it can have high impact, and there's a large amount of evidence behind that as well. So it's a secure evidence base. Many meta-analyses from international studies as well, taken fairly recently. So we've got recent evidence and a large amount that evaluates the impact on attainment scores. So a solid base. There are a couple of red flags to that as well, which I will mention in the next couple of slides. A lot of the studies have looked at English or mathematics or numeracy and literacy. And there is some other evidence for core subjects where studies have been carried out in science, less so for other subjects. But what those studies and those evaluation systematic reviews have shown is that a consistent approach, and that's why we end up with this secure evidence base and a +7 potential for progress. It's low in terms of cost, less than £80, and that includes the programs that will be delivered, but doesn't necessarily include all the time teacher release time to attend it. But it's low cost in relation to other CPD. And it says here then, so it can be particularly beneficial. There have been individual studies into studies like Learning to Learn, and they have found positive impacts. But I think one thing that when we think about your course that you've completed or are completing with Billsley, is it can be particularly beneficial for low-income families and children from those disadvantaged backgrounds. There is a red flag with that as well. So, like I said, if you can bear with me on this, I'll explain everything in full. Teaching these strategies can be beneficial for low-achieving subjects, not just low-achieving pupils, not just disadvantaged pupils. And that actually collaborative work can be seen to be very, very effective. And the kind of the core metacognitive skills where pupils are learning from the evaluation of each other's attempts to learning as well, through explicit discussion and modelling of each other can be very beneficial, more at secondary level than at primary level. There have been a number of studies in which involve metacognitive and self-regulatory skills, which the EEF have carried out themselves, and they include, you see their self-regulation to improve writing. That was a primary course, at very low cost. Thinking and doing science, and then philosophy for children, and all of them had moderate to positive impacts on children. And when you actually click on the EEF's Teaching and Learning Toolkit, and you see all of those bars like you can see at the bottom of the screen, if you actually click into that bar, it then takes you to the evidence behind the guidance report itself, and provides you with a number of different signposts to then explore those in more detail, including things like the self-regulation to improve in writing, and directs you to the EEF studies. And what I've done is I've kind of done that, and I've looked at the overarching evidence, but then I've also looked at this review here, which was done by Daniel Mears, and he looked at the evidence. There's a 58-page document, this one, and what I've done is I've in 3 slides, sorry, I've extracted kind of the main points, of which I mentioned before, some red flags and a difference between primary and secondary. And I said it can have an impact in low-income families or disadvantaged families, but I did say that there's some caveats with that as well. So one of the sections of this guidance, evidence review, section 3 is about does it have any evidence? Is there any evidence that disadvantaged groups have lower levels of self-regulatory skills, or that they benefit more from self-regulatory interventions? And it says the evidence is somewhat limited, but there are some positives within there. There are modest correlations between socioeconomic status and the use of metacognitive strategies, with pupils from higher socioeconomic status backgrounds using them more. But again, red flags will be that some of that research was using self-report rather than external evaluation, so the students reporting themselves how many self-regulatory and metacognitive skills they use. When we dig a little bit deeper, there are a number of international studies that show that socioeconomic status and there's a modest positive relationship with scores. When we dig even further into the research as well, it says that lower performing students used fewer cognitive strategies, even where teachers had modelled several for them, and higher achieving students had used all the modelled strategies. So there is beginning to become a bit of a divide between the number of strategies in that cognitive toolbox and the number of ways in which students applied them. There is a link between those to do with socioeconomic status. This statement's, quite a bold statement, and one that I wasn't expecting until we looked at this evidence review, and one which is maybe a little bit disheartening. But it says here, so there's no convincing evidence that pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds benefit more from those than an advantaged background. But I think what we've got to really think about here, the point behind this, is the metacognition and self-regulation might not be a gap closer, but what it will do is it'll lift the floor, because what they're saying is it'll have a real positive impact on those students. It will bolster their toolkit, and it'll be able to provide them with a greater number of strategies. Yes, more able students or those from a higher socioeconomic background status have been seen to use them more. However, when the research has been evaluated, it has had a positive impact on disadvantaged children and on lower attaining students. So therefore, we might not be using it as a gap closer, but we may be using it as a raising the bar or the floor of attainment to bolster our achievement in schools. And that, for a disadvantaged students, when you think about opening up pathways, opening up routes into achievement, progress, further study, opportunities in life, is a real positive thing. So, I think what we've really got to think about here as well is when we're completing our school improvement plans, primary and secondary, and we're talking about strategies that we will use to close the gap, I would be quite nervous myself as a leader to be putting metacognition and self-regulation in there as an identified strategy to close gaps. And I think you need to be thinking about that in your school settings, as well as how is it presented and how is it written about in school improvement planning? How is it talked about amongst staff? When we're presenting CPD to our colleagues, are we saying that this is something which is going to, benefit those students, or are we saying this is something which is going to close the gap? Because actually that technically would be not correct. The closing the gap bit, the benefit, obviously, yes. So then we move on a little bit further into this research, and what it does is it confirms that it's context dependent, and that in order to be competent at metacognitive skills, they need to have that foundation of knowledge in specific subjects and strategies within specific subjects. And it might be difficult for those children to transfer those between subjects, and therefore it becomes quite domain specific, which is, I guess, that's what this point's just emphasised there. It's not automatic. Just moving on from that as well, then, I've talked before about group work, is that actually a social aspects of metacognition are quite powerful. Individuals can go through metacognitive processes, but we all know that the extent to which children and the interaction with an adult small group tuition can provide the environment where children begin to really learn from each other, and allows them the opportunity to verbalise what they're thinking, how they've approached a task, why they've stopped doing something, why they've started doing something else. And I think that's really, really important as another point. And then Here we talk about the well, I guess that's what I've just mentioned there, isn't it? Co-regulation of groups and children being able to benefit from each other. This is the last one about the research, but just thought it's important to go through the main points. It talks about a mixed picture when it comes to intervention duration. So, you know, people often ask the question, how long should I put this strategy in place for? How often should we do it? And there is a mixed findings to this. The findings generally say that longer interventions over a certain period, in this case from De Boer's research, over 20 weeks, tend to have a lower effect size rather than a short, sharp blast of a term, as where we're looking at it. However, that's contradicted by somebody else, of course, like all the research does say. You know, there's a lot of caveats in a lot of it, but more effective the longer they are in time has been found by some. However, some of this is age dependent, and much of the research says is that most effective interventions reviewed tended to be over a relatively long duration, at least a term, and more typically a whole school year with at least one session a week. And that's really important for us, particularly when we're thinking about changing children's habits. You know, even for adults and planning their lessons and their habits of teaching. They say to change a habit, on average, it takes between 12 and 18 months to change a habit, and that would suggest that the research, which says a longer period of time invested in other schools development, would be more beneficial for members of staff and their children. It does say as well that the younger the child, the more explicit instruction is typically needed. And I don't think I need to dwell on that fact from you know, the colleagues on the line as well, and the age ranges we teach. I think it's fairly straightforward to see why that is the case, and that there's some suggestion that evidence that collaborative approaches may work better in secondary, and that's more to do with the maturity, but also as well the range of cognitive strategies that they have to share with each other, to then be metacognitive and evaluative about. And then very finally, there are not just one, but there are some fields of research which have said that at the earlier stages, at least, that shorter intervention and shorter programs might be appropriate, rather than the longer ones required potentially at secondary. I've put within this PowerPoint the hyperlinks. I've directed to page numbers, and in the notes below each of the slides as well, there's additional information. So I would urge you to have a look at that. But like I did say, you know, the first port of call would be the guidance reports, but then not to forget that the research is emerging as we go along, and there's lots of reviews about this, which constantly brings out new findings. And there was a really interesting graph actually that said the number of pieces of research has doubled in the last 5 years on metacognition, or the findings that have been reported have doubled in the last 5 years versus where they were from the early 2000s. Not to say that metacognition is a new term, not at all, because it goes right back to, you know, work of Vygotsky and right back into the 30s, 1930s, when it was first coined and used in findings. And 4 of the myths, well, some of those have been kind of discussed a little bit by what I've just mentioned with the research, but it's only developed in older pupils, and it's not, you know, those of you that are parents, you only have to sit with a young child at the age of 2 or 3 and see them trying to stack cups and fit the cups back into, you know, the coloured cups that you get from what used to be the Early Learning Centre, but you know, they're trying to stack them on top of each other, or they're trying to fit them all back neatly inside one another, and they realise that one doesn't fit, and they've got one left over that's too big and they can't fit it in. You know, the metacognitive skills that are happening and being developed from a very, very young age. You know, the evidence suggests that it can be as young as 2 to 3, where the metacognitive skills begin to evaluate, this isn't working, I need to then try something else. And you think about that as well, the interaction with adults, the amount of modelling and scaffolding that parents will put in place to try to develop skills with their own children, it shows that, you know, from a very early age they're picking these up. But maybe less conscious about obviously thinking themselves. Oh, I'm engaging in metacognition, etc. So metacognition is a general skill that can be separated from subject knowledge. There's another myth. It needs to be kind of planned, interlinked, an integral part of every single subject in school. Like I said, the skills are very specific to the subject, and the evidence suggests that children, it's not automatic, the transfer of these skills between subjects. But you can easily teach metacognitive knowledge and strategies in discrete thinking skills lessons. You know, depending on how long you've been around, but you know, thinking skills lessons were quite common when it came to kind of PSHE and different approaches to learning. I would say probably 10, 15 years ago. You know, there are still strategies out there. You know, the learning to learn strategy, which have merit. You know, I'm not liking those at all. But it's thinking about how they can be integrated into subjects rather than taught in discrete subjects and standalone subjects, because without that content to latch it onto, becomes a little bit lost within there. And then this one's a key one as well, is that metacognition represents higher order thinking and is therefore more important than cognition or subject knowledge. And whilst the actual engagement in metacognitive thinking can be deemed as higher order, without the knowledge, the comprehension, if you were to look at Bloom's taxonomy and work your way up that taxonomy, you'd start with knowledge and comprehension. You know, without that, you know, we can't jump headfirst into higher order thinking and challenge, because without that kind of context and with that underpinning foundation of knowledge, it's going to be lost on the children and not effective in terms of planning. So within the EEF guidance report, there are 7 recommendations, excuse me, and I'll just blow those up for you there. What I really like about this guidance report for metacognition and self-regulation is that the suggestions in the bullet points underneath these recommendations seem to be much more teacher-friendly, and by that I mean user-friendly practically in lessons and how it can inform their planning. This is one which I think significantly informs lesson planning and really allows teachers, you know, the question that we get asked a lot from the guidance reports is, so how do I put that into practice? And you only have to look at, you know, for example, recommendation 5 on here, promoting metacognitive talk, and then look at the bullet points underneath, and it says, well, we need explicit instruction, modelling and classroom dialogue can be used to develop metacognitive skills. Read on a little bit further, pupil to pupil and pupil to teacher talk can help build up knowledge. And then when we actually unpick those a little bit further, well, the question is, so what do these look like? And show me examples what these look like. And this is where this guidance report really comes to life, actually. It supports both senior leaders, but it also supports teachers as well. And the next slide is just those in more detail. So at this point then, what I want you to do is, if we're able to, I'd like you to jump into breakout rooms. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen in a second. But what I'd like you to do is, I'd like you to think of a specific student that you teach or have taught recently, who's one of the most effective learners in your school. And what is it that they do? So what kind of, you know, behaviours, traits, when you work with them in a lesson, when they're faced with tasks, what type of questions do they ask? What type of things do they do? What type of approaches do they take? How do they fare in unfamiliar situations, assessments, etc.? So what I want you to do is, I was going to pop you into breakout rooms only for 4 minutes, and I want you to just discuss with the people that you're in the breakout room with, what is it that those children do? And then what I'm going to ask you to do is, when you come back into the main room where we all are, I'll just ask a couple of groups to feedback, and whoever has the surname that appears first alphabetically, I'd like you to feedback. Be prepared to just feedback from your group if you can, and your mics are working and things like that. So we'll trial that when we get back. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. So within the guidance report, it suggests that by the age of 11, effective learners will be able to do a number of things, similar to what Jodie said there, actually, you know, being able to make links, particularly with bigger picture learning, where it happens, what they've learned previously, evaluating their work, discussing how they might improve it, as well as just exploring that cognitive toolbox that we mentioned before, and that's by the age of 11. Now, obviously, that grows and extends throughout the school year for those that are effective, and throughout the secondary school on top of year 11. We've mentioned about the skills being featuring early on in school for children for younger years as well. One question, well, I say one question, actually, quite a few questions that were just posed is why? There will be explicit teaching going on right the way from early years, right the way up through primary and secondary, so they'll pick things up from school significantly, in many different disciplines as well. Really successful modelling, highly effective teaching, I'm sure, from the schools that we work in and that you guys lead on as well. Role models at home have been another factor. Support materials and why some children are incredibly effective. And then this other factor as well, being context, exposure to the learning opportunities that they have. And that then makes us think back again to kind of disadvantaged pupils, and we think about that kind of cultural capital aspect of it. But when we think about that, what we're actually thinking about is the exposure to learning, exposure to both knowledge and understanding, as well as experiences. And with those experiences will come the experiences of being evaluative, of being kind of self-regulatory, and that can come in all walks of life, whether it be a sports club on a Saturday, a music lesson, for your non-disadvantaged children versus what they may very well be missing out on if they are disadvantaged. Even something as reading at home with their parents, and reading out loud and engaging in talk through that reading versus not having that experience can have a significant impact, as you very well know. But through a metacognitive lens and a self-regulatory lens, it's another layer of opportunities that can be missed by that pupil. There are 4 levels of metacognitive learners that David Perkins actually came up with and shared in 1992 from his research, and those are from your tacit learners, aware learners, strategic learners, and reflective learners. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to stop sharing here. I'm going to drop a hyperlink into the chat box, where it takes you to the Cambridge Assessment Metacognition site, which is actually a really, really good website. I'm going to drop this web link in here. Now, this web page that it takes you to has all of metacognition on one page. I want you to scroll right to the bottom, and there's a glossary in a light blue area of the page is a glossary. The video that I'd like you to watch is just above that glossary. Now, I can't embed it into a PowerPoint, otherwise I'd have made it easier for myself and for you guys to access it. So if you can, access this video. It's 3 minutes long, and what it actually is it's one of the leads at Cambridge talking through those different types of learners and how they might present themselves with the behaviours and how they tackle work in your classrooms. So there we go. The video is 3 minutes long, so I'll come back at 4:20. It should give you enough time. Okay, hopefully that's just given you enough time to view that video. Good website that is, and actually, you know, above that video there's a whole range of resources, information, guides you through it quite nicely as well, and it links very, very closely to the guidance report. So you know, the two align very, very well. I'm just going to put, so this hyperlink that I'm going to put in the chat now, you don't need to go to it right now, but that is the hyperlink if you wanted to cut and paste it and store it, which takes you directly to the slide that I've just shown with the four, with the quarters on the different types of metacognitive learners, the 4 levels, and the one that I'm going to restart my resharing of my screen with now. So the hyperlink that I popped in there was this screen here. A resource which you can actually use for this, and the reason why I popped it in for you is because it's a really, really good task to do with your members of the staff in school, and to just say to them, right, okay, if you're reviewing classes, where would you put learners in each of these quarters, which categories do most students fall into, and then after they've done that as a class, which I think they'll find quite an easy task to do, is to be able to then question and say, okay, so now you've popped your children into those 4 quarters, now highlight where the disadvantaged children fall. And when I've done this in the past, and it's not always the case, but when I've done this in the past, by putting the children into these areas, not all of those disadvantaged children fall into, you know, categories 1 or 2, because then it reinforces the fact that actually they may be disadvantaged, but they may be able and disadvantaged. You know, when we did it in school here, I did it myself. Particularly, I remember that the forces, a couple of forces children, you know, ended up in my reflective learners box, and actually by going through that process of thinking through that lens of metacognition, I actually realised that my disadvantaged, 2 of my disadvantaged children, just reinforced that fact that from a metacognitive point of view, yes, they were already on my radar as being great and, you know, achieving very well, but you know, what else could I help, and what other lens could I look through my planning on? So, you know, it's a useful task just to reflect again and to unpick our classrooms on another level. Another way of doing that is through this resource. Again, all these are hyperlinked at the bottom of the slides when we share them, and I'll ask Carl or Rosina to send those out to you. But this one here is actually a resource that came from the early years foundation stage, from the and it links to the SEND toolkit, but a way of reflecting and rag rating current practices. So rag rating our teaching and learning in our classrooms of how children respond. So you can either do this on a class level, or you can do it on an individual pupil level. But again, just another way of evaluating what my current practice is, and self-reporting. But then when I mentioned that it links to the SEND guidance report for mainstream schools, there is a real good diagram in there which talks about, you know, the degree to which we support children, and the degree to which we can utilise the skills of teaching assistants and ICEs to be able to support children through scaffolding and prompting and cueing and modelling. And this diagram actually links really, really closely to the metacognition guidance report, because when we think about how we effectively support children, we can also think about how we less effectively support children, and jump in too quickly to correct mistakes rather than provide them with the tools to almost reflect and evaluate. Now, some teaching assistants that I've worked with they're exceptional at providing that adaptive teaching, and providing almost like that scripted way of metacognitive talk to get children to reflect on the methods that they're using. But what it does do as well is it makes us think about that professional learning angle for our teachers in school, and how integrated the ICEs and the teaching assistants should be within the understanding of the knowledge and the knowledge and the strategies within metacognition, and the benefit that could have, whether it be within the whole class or small group support sessions. I think that's really, really key. And another challenge for us. This is actually a resource taken from a supportive resource for the SEND guidance reports, and you'll see within there that it really specifically highlights metacognitive strategies and chunking, whether it talks about specific strategies to solve problems in maths or evaluate learning in other areas. Chunking of tasks at each stage will support SEND, but we also know as well that it directly supports all types of learners, and you'll have heard that said many times about, you know, good teachers of SEND are good teachers of all. But then within there we've got the scaffolding and explicit instruction as well. So really core fundamental parts of teaching. You know, they appear everywhere, don't they? You know, let's face it, they appear in the vast majority of guidance reports, and it's all lens towards that quality of teaching first time around. So I've mentioned about the implication for CPD and for planning across the year group for teaching assistants, ISAs, and other stuff as well. So again, coming back to that point that metacognition and self-regulation is not something that's naturally developed by all pupils. First, the whole first part of that session there was about evaluating where we are, understanding what it means before we then launch headfirst into what does it mean for planning. And I really do think that, you know, when we're planning lessons, are we planning with a primary focus on subject knowledge and understanding, or are we planning it based on skills, and is there a divide between the two? And then are we considering on top of that the additional layer of adaptive teaching and metacognition as well? And, you know, we are juggling so many things. It's really difficult to try to fit all of these things in as such. But I think with the change, particularly at secondary, I can't really speak firsthand from a primary level, but from secondary, the change of the exam specifications, how many years ago now are we talking? 5 years ago, has really kind of made people change the ways in which they see or perceive the need to cram the content in. You know, being very content heavy, it's about knowledge delivery, it's about knowledge recall, it's about actually how many times within a scheme of work in your school would you see explicit reference to metacognition or to self-regulation or to evaluation of strategies. You know, it probably doesn't appear as much explicitly. I'm sure it's there in classrooms, but doesn't appear explicitly as maybe it should do. And for that instance, what we need to do is we need to really think about this conscious effort to draw attention to those skills that teachers are engaging with, and really just shine a spotlight on it in order for it to be placed at the forefront of our teachers' minds when it comes to planning and collaborative planning, obviously through their subject-specific lenses. Now, I've jumped back to the research here. I'm not going to read all of this out, but from that evaluation of the evidence review of research, page 26 in this one talks about, so what types of learning strategies are effective? You know, it's kind of like the answer that everybody wants to know, what should I do? And it breaks it down into 9 quite concise bullet points. And that goes through cognitive strategies from rehearsal and elaboration and organisation. And I think they're really good reminders and pointers for staff. And like I said before, that many of those will be kind of integrated into planning already. They will appear, but it's how explicitly do we draw attention to those with the children to say that this is what this is the strategy that we're doing. And actually, particularly when it comes to things like organisation strategies, we might design our worksheets, create our activities, but then not draw the attention as to why we've designed them as we have, why we've engaged in the type of thought processes as to which bits to dismiss, which bits to take forward, which bits to try, what worked and what didn't. And I think that's where it's the teacher that brings it all to life, isn't it? Going down to metacognitive strategies, then we've got the planning, the monitoring and the evaluation links very nicely with that diagram, and you can see now where the pulled those 3 from, and then metacognitive knowledge, which is the top part of the diagram, the blue diagram I showed before. I just wanted to kind of flag this up to you because you know, if you went to page 26, there's a little bit more prose after that explains around these. What does that really look like then? Well, in the guidance report for metacognition, you'll see this framework for thinking and for planning. And what it says is it kind of distills it down from those 9 bullet points even further into 7 parts of kind of learning over time or planning over time, and how we can explicitly teach it. And you'll see that throughout that model, there's a gradual transfer of input from teacher to student, so the ratio becomes more towards a student kind of independence towards learning. Now, it's probably important to say at this point as well that this is a structure provided, but it isn't intended that it's a structure that is a lesson plan. You know, with the best will in the world, you know, I don't know how long your lessons are, but it's difficult to get all of that in. So this could be taken as a sequence of learning over time, and it could very well be. It links back to that point as well, doesn't it, about the building up of the prior knowledge and the building up towards higher order skills, and that it doesn't sit separately. The myth that it sits separately, and that it's higher order skills straight from the beginning. So, this model I'll come back to, but within the guidance report, it talks about the need to really think about each of these stages and draw attention as leaders to our staff for each of these stages. I will come back to this in a few slides' time. So it's just to present that model to you. Now, when we then look at planning and look at where we should start with our tasks, one of the recommendations in the guidance report is about setting appropriate levels of challenge. And one of those ways of reflecting on that, just jumped again, sorry. One of the ways of reflecting on that is when a pupil is faced with a very challenging task, they will start to tap into their knowledge of that task and their knowledge of strategies and look at metacognitive knowledge. And the types of questions that they will be asked when faced with a task, I think is important to share with our teachers within school, because these are the issues that we're trying to address. The issue with metacognition, overarching issue, is that it's thinking, and it's not explicit to us as teachers. We have to identify it, we have to understand it, and it's not necessarily always presented because it's inside the children's brains when they're thinking in lessons, and that for us makes our job incredibly difficult. You know, the child at the back who's sat thinking, maybe thinking about all of these questions at once, or in a sequence, obviously, and we're not aware of that unless they talk to us, tell us, or we question them. So that makes it incredibly challenging. So by presenting up front how children can think about a task when it's provided for them to attempt in a lesson, this is where we can then start to inform our planning and think about, you know, how can I dissolve each one of these questions and each one of these barriers to make the learning more accessible. And that's where it starts to make us think about, you know, the amount of time, effort, and understanding in quality planning. You know, it just reinforces it, doesn't it? That the planning of the lesson's been the most important aspect before we even get into the classroom to then deliver. The EF have produced a resource, and on the next slide is kind of a takeaway resource for you. But it's the same thing. It's looking at planning, monitoring, evaluating. And what it does is it thinks about the knowledge of tasks, strategies, and self, and then breaks that down into questions which students have commonly asked at each point, you know, about how they're managing it, how they're building, linking and prior knowledge, how they're evaluating their strategies and whether it worked. And what these are actually good is these are a good prompt framework for metacognitive talk for members of staff in classrooms. So, right, okay, well, you know, which strategies did you select? I'm looking at the bottom box in the middle at the minute there, so reviewing effectiveness of strategies. You know, if I turn that into how I'm going to approach a task with a pupil, I'd say, okay, well, you know, which strategies did you have available to you? Which strategy did you select and why? Why didn't you choose the other ones? Did you stick with that strategy all the way throughout? And at what point did it get difficult? And at what point did you think you might look towards another strategy, or actually you hit a dead end? So what else is available to you? And actually what that does is it makes it really easy for me to develop my metacognitive talk with students, even if I'm not necessarily used to, or it feels myself as a member of staff an uncomfortable situation, and I'm trying to change my style of teaching or my habits of teaching. So there's a takeaway resource there which could be quite useful for you. I've mentioned metacognitive talk a couple of times. So what I am going to do is I'm just going to jump out of sharing my slides again. I have got another hyperlink for you. This one's a 2-minute video, and it is Tom Sherrington talking about metacognitive talk. Now, the video starts, I think, at 15 minutes. There's a pause for about 11 seconds at the beginning, and then he starts talking for literally 2 minutes before he moves on to another section. Don't move on to the other sections. I'm going to give you literally 2.5 minutes to have a watch of this little clip from Tom Sherrington. So in the guidance report, so come back to the guidance report, and talks about recommendation 6 about explicitly teaching pupils how to organise and self-manage, and that metacognitive talk is a method of doing that. It also says in the guidance report that all teachers use modelling to some extent, and they will be doing it, and a huge focus on when you think about key things that have really taken a hand in the last couple of years. Look at retrieval practice and modelling and scaffolding, and I think particularly could potentially be one of the, if there are any benefits of COVID, and I don't mean that in the lightest sense at all, but from teaching perspective, how teachers have been forced to refine their skills to model remotely, and then to be able to break down tasks into chunks, into really clear explanations, into explanations around metacognition and why they've been following methods that they have, the use of visualizers to be able to do that. I think there are benefits that we can retain, and that teachers will have developed without really thinking about metacognition, but they will have been developing it significantly. So that positive is good for us and good for children. Within that video, Tom Sherrington talks about explicit thinking and modelling, and narrating out loud, and planning for that, which obviously links back to the guidance reports. And I think with that, then there's almost like a word of warning when we look at examples. And there's an example here from Mr. Thornton Teach, who's a history teacher, or he retweeted it. He might not be a history teacher himself, but as an example, you'll have seen many times the I do, we do, you do approach. So I do, we do, you do jointly, and then I do, we do, you do independently. And what I really like about this example on the screen in front of you from a history example, and this would have taken a long time with children, potentially a whole lesson or more, is the I do is, it's a worked example, but it's the unpicking of that worked example. There's 3 boxes below, and all they're doing simply is to classify what's content and evidence from the source, what their own knowledge is, and then the provenance of that content. And I think that's, collectively to model that to students, and then they begin to have a go at that themselves. The joint construction is step 2. Collaboratively write an answer to source B through the use of a whiteboard and through the use of a visualizer, and be able to map in that out. And I've got some video links that I'm going to share with you later, which has got that in lots of different subjects, English and PE, and some metacognitive videos which are really well modelled, which I'll be able to share. To then move on to the we do completion model, but you'll see with scaffolding in place in the sentence stems, building on from that example from step 2, and then removing that scaffolding. And a real key feature of the metacognition guidance report is the removal of the scaffolding, and links directly back to that SEND report as well, about the use of teaching assistants and the extent to which we scaffold. But then where it's critical is that we are reluctant in some cases with SEND learners to be able to remove that scaffolding as quickly or as much as we do with other learners. So moving on to that independent one. But if you look at step 4, it's got the 3, the classification using the key that it had in step 1 as well. So there's an independent, but it also links them back to the skills in which they did in step 1. And I think, you imagine that metacognitive talk guiding pupils through each of those, talking them through the decision making, the effectiveness, the things that might not have worked, and the choices and decisions made in learning. You can see how that would work. The word of warning comes from where we provide resources, and you'll be aware of these types of things being provided in your schools. You know, structure strips, vocab lists, model answers, etc. But where the metacognitive talk is missing, you know, and you hear the teacher say things like, oh, I've given them all the resources, I've given them everything, I've given them model answers, I've given them this, I've given them that, and they still can't do it. And then you think, okay, well, you know, do we go back to the drawing board at that point? And I guess the question is do we use metacognitive talk to bring these resources to life? Or do we expect the students to know, and the worst case scenarios, do we expect the resource to do the teaching for us? So when we see resources in classrooms that have been, you know, through quality assurance exercises, and we see these being carried out, but we see children struggling, have they used these before? Is this habitual in their thinking? Is this a common feature of the member of staff's teaching? So there's kind of a word of warning, but it's a word of warning based off the previous example, which I think is a really strong positive, and almost something that we should be aiming for. And this is another takeaway, and it's just a set of questions of how to script in metacognition. So something which teachers can try to integrate, an opportunity to integrate into their plans. If you know, they're not going to write the questions in those plans, but then it is in person, an opportunity for adaptive teaching and modelling with students, and as well an opportunity for them to then kind of adapt their teaching in person with them. Just a range of stems, and to try to support staff to think about how they are using the resources particularly, and how they're working that talk into their lessons at every opportunity. You know, and when I say teachers, you know, I mean all adults that work with children, really. An example from the guidance report, which they've given here, is another example from history, actually. But what they've done is they've guided you through a model of how the 7 steps can be applied to learning. Now, this one, like I said before, this suggests that actually it looks like it could be a lesson from beginning to end. It has to be a fairly long lesson, I think, but what they've done is they've activated prior knowledge of the causes of World War I, but then they've supported students with a structure and an explicit strategy to be able to organise that information, and then guiding through the causes and effects of World War I by classifying them into different categories. Means that by chunking them, we've got the opportunity for, with whether it be mnemonics or whether it be other ways of aiding memory, but it links to the memorisation of the strategy and the practice of it to support the retrieval at a future in a future lesson. Guided practice, so teacher models further fishbone cause with the whole group, and then pupils then begin to practice independently by removing that scaffolding from them. So really, really simple structure. And you know, like we said, we will see teachers doing this across our schools currently, but it's about capturing that best practice in that structure to shine a spotlight on it, to then share that beyond the classrooms and reduce that in-school variation of quality of teaching. Later on then, Tom Sherrington talks about not only from explicit modelling, but he talks about monitoring success and that evaluation phase, which was the bottom of the blue diagram from the EEF. And he talks about monitoring and evaluation. So another takeaway here is, again, another set of sentence stems to I guess for staff to signpost within their lessons more of the evaluation and the monitoring to tap into the self-regulation of students, you know, and you can see those from yourselves there. You know, what do we think will happen next? What would happen if we did differently? What did we learn from what we did? What would we continue to do? What would we do less of? You know, why is an aspect of what I did wrong, etc., etc., etc. And when we cast your mind back to the 4 different types of metacognitive learners, these are the types of questions that your strategic learners may not ask as many of, but they will ask some of. But then the 4th group would begin to really think about the reflective group would really think about those unfamiliar situations. I'm a geography teacher, the pupils who would get A's and A stars might be the ones that might struggle in a decision-making exam at GCSE, which is unfamiliar, or A-level. Unfamiliar situations, and these types of pupils are the ones that would ask these questions naturally. So this is more to build up those skills with the kind of the aware or the tacit learners, to try to get them to begin to use these types of questions within their everyday thinking. Just moving forward then, so we've got about 10 minutes left, so we're just about on time. And what I was going to ask you to do, just as a reflective exercise from your school's perspective at the minute, is just to have a look at those 7 aspects of learning that the EF recommend in their structure to build in metacognitive skills, and just cast your eye down those and just have almost a bit of a rank actually. Which of these would appear to be the most established as planning, teaching and learning routines in your school? And I'll lay my cards on the table straight away, as I would say, and we did this with our staff in September actually in one of our inset days, and modelling was very, very high up on there. The one that came top was activating prior knowledge, and then they said memorisation of strategy as our top 3. Which I wasn't surprised at, based on the initiatives and the ways in which we've guided professional learning in the past. But if I just unshare my screen, can I do that? Because in fact, actually, I'll unshare my screen in a second. All I want you to do is I want you to just type the top 3 that you think are the most established into the chat box. You could just type the numbers actually, if you wanted to. Okay, I'll stop sharing so I can see the chat box and just see what responses are there. Okay, so I mean, you can all see there's a definite pattern there, isn't there? Activating prior knowledge, and there's a fair few 2s and 3s, but nice to see some 4, 5s. There's no 7s. But I mean, if you think about what it does, is it just shows up the complete unique context that we're all working in, the expertise of our staff. I guess they're potentially a reflection on the professional learning, the routes we've taken to guide our staff of what we think quality lessons are. But there are some definite patterns in there. 1 and 3 probably the most prominent, and a couple of 5s, 3 6s, but not very many 7s. And less 4s as well, actually. So if I jump back in, oops. So coming towards the end then. Activating prior knowledge, are we surprised with that? The amount of retrieval practice that's going around in schools at the minute. It's amazing we've got time to learn anything else and we're not just retrieving everything at the minute. So, how am I joking? So, yeah, modelling of learning strategies, independent learning, but structured reflection probably appearing less. And I think, when we consider the approaches we've taken, does that need to then inform our QA practices going forward? Is it something that we haven't explicitly gone looking for? Have middle leaders been trained to look for good and bad examples of what they look like, what each of those look like? Is structured reflection happening? The bright spots in school that it's actually happening there, but we just might not necessarily be seeing it and capturing that best practice as possible. So the question on the back of this is, do we need to go, and I hate to use the term a deep dive, but do we need to really focus on honing on an area more to establish understanding around that area, or inform CPD or awareness and teacher knowledge and understanding in those areas? There is another example, I'm not going to run through this one, but there is another example in the guidance report which gives you an example from science. And again, this is for me to reinforce the point that, from our professional learning, does it align with these 7 stages? Have we covered areas previously, and have we not covered areas? And you know where I'm heading with this. Apart from QA, which recommendation 7 talks about school leadership, providing teachers with time to support and make sure that these approaches are implemented consistently. In order for that, the first part of our implementation should be, you know, that reflection and that review to make sure that, you know, in that guidance report, the implementation and putting evidence to work guidance report, 31 of the 37 pages are about exploring and making sure we've actually got the right school improvement targets or aims really refined and drilled down and communicated very clearly before we then go on to the prepare and launch stages. And that's one of the recommendations within this guidance report as well. There's an example which this one came from, let me think, it was HISP Research School, where they've actually looked at trying to get members of staff to specifically reflect on their planning, to think about are we covering as much as we possibly can in lessons. You know, I did say to you before as well here though, we can't do everything all the time. So I personally, I'm not sure I would be guiding my members of staff to make sure they have it's not a checklist. It's definitely not a checklist is what this is presented as. I think I would be looking to see how they are built up over a series of lessons, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 lessons, a shorter scheme of work potentially. And that there's the diagram from the putting evidence to work guidance reports. And the key message from the EEF with all of that is it's not possible to do it all, and that less done well is better. I'm not sure I'll quite phrase that right on there, less done better, but that's what I was trying to get across to you. So where might you head next with this then, with your staff, if this becomes an area of a priority for you and you think an area which teaching and learning wise you'd like to engage with more? A good starting point is to try to engage staff with the application of the theory in their own planning. So taking a scheme of learning, taking a lesson that they've delivered recently, where children have learnt a new skill or have had the opportunity to apply new knowledge to a previously learned technique or a method or a skill, and you know, get them to engage with that planning process, get them to really reflect on what they do currently. You know, where is their explicit planning for metacognition after they've been introduced to the theory? Where have they brought it to life as a person? You know, where have they adapted their teaching? Where have they, you know, showed that craft in the classroom? And where are the opportunities to make it more explicit as the starting point and the precursor to then kicking on with what the examples look like and what those model examples look like. I did mention another takeaway. So on here, additional signposts. Durrington Research School have produced some very short, snappy videos from a range of different subjects. Walking and talking through their aim for students, but walking and talking them through, you know, how to write about interpretation of poetry in English, and you know, there's some good examples in there, and they are secondary level ones. So you know, in fact, I'll have a look at some more primary examples actually, and see if we can dig some out and share some, because I think we've got some. I've definitely got some from Maths Hubs, which are very useful in their way in which they have found how children hit brick walls and then back up and try new strategies. And I think maths is a good example for that. There's the hyperlink to the guidance report itself. And then there is the hyperlink to the Cambridge assessment where you watch the video from, but that whole web page. And then there are on that metacognition.org.uk, which I showed you before, under the teaching staff tab, there's some explainer videos, which actually are really, really useful for kind of independent learning of staff. And if you wanted to take that blended approach with your CPD for staff, there's some quite good videos on there to be able to support staff to develop. And finally, very last point, and it's one that I mentioned before, but I'm going to hammer it again. 7 guidance reports, 7 recommendations just in this guidance report. And the message that I know you'll have had from Carl across the disadvantage course that you've been doing, and particularly as you get to the point of implementation now, is that effective implementation is hard. It starts with selecting priorities, and doing fewer things well is the main priority to establishing the best chances of giving those strategies the chance of being successful in your schools. Just about bang on time. I appreciate that today you've listened to me in my monotone accent for a long time. You know, I wouldn't want to subject many people to that if I had to, but I am really grateful for your time. I know you've been there and listening. I can see your interaction on the chat. I can see your interaction with each other through the chat rooms. If there's anything else that we can help you with, then please, you know, via Carl and Asima, get in touch, and we can support you as best as we possibly can. I will send Carl and Asima the resources, and they'll send them all out to you, so you should have everything in one place to reflect back on. That's me done.
Nathan, thank you very, very much. So much in that session. I just made myself so many notes, and we've been kind of looking at developing metacognition within our school probably over the last 4 years. But actually, just listening to you there's so much still to reflect on in terms of where our strengths are, and areas still for us to develop. So, I mean, and Nathan's touched on the point there, if you wanted to find out more, and if you spoke to colleagues around this and felt you wanted to explore this further, whether that was this academic year or next academic year, ourselves or Nathan could support you with that back in schools. This is the first of our optional modules. We have others coming up, one on maths mastery, one on reading for pleasure, and then we have Nathan delivering one for us on SEND provision too. So if you haven't signed up for those, please do too. But once again, Nathan, thanks. That was such a great session. I've read lots, but I learned so much anyway listening to you again. So that's it's great.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting us as well, and you know, I hope it was useful, because you know, if it helps a few people along the way, then it's all the best, isn't it?